Now, can I put a proposition to both of you that whether you like it or not, politics affects what your organisations are trying to achieve. On the one hand, Doron, your organisation, Save a Child's Heart, is getting on with the job of helping children whose heart health is seriously affected. And I think you try and remain apolitical as much as possible. On the other hand, Jason, in spite of the title of the piece you wrote for SBS, very politically active, Save the Children, and I think your article is blaming Israel a lot for the sorry plight of Palestinian children. Your organisation, unfortunately, it seems, Jason, is putting a lot of blame and responsibility on Israel, and you seem, on the other hand, to be letting the Palestinian Authority and Hamas off scot-free. Do you want to perhaps explain how you can effectively do a job if you're being so politically involved and apportioning so much blame on Israel in the territories?
Yep. So first and foremost, I want to say it's not about blames, but accountabilities. So the rights of children are universal, unequivocal, and indivisible. That means that any child, no matter who they are, where they are, what their background is, the same rights afforded to every single child. And again, this speaks to Doron's point where a child is a child. A child's life, no matter who they are, is important. And so what Save the Children does is, because we are a child rights organization, and in fact, our founder, Eglantine Jebb, was a remarkable woman who wrote what is the basis for the UN Conventions of the Rights of the Child. So these are rights that children globally have to be given. And this is what we fight for, the accountability of those rights. So I think, when you look at any of our statements, any of our reports, I mean, you've seen a copy of our report, we hold duty bearers to account for what is their obligations under international law that they have to. It's not a choice. These are obligations that member states have signed up to, which they have to adhere to, which is under international humanitarian law, international human rights law. States like Australia, states like Israel, states like the UK, the US, all of us have to adhere to those things. It's an obligation. So when you look through our report, we actually don't assign blame, but we look at who is the one that is contravening those obligations. So in the particular case of the report that you mentioned on demolitions, we have recommendations for both the state of Israel in terms of the practices that they are contravening under international law. So the demolitions, the evictions, the settlements, all of those things are illegal under international law, but also under Israeli law. So, we're just calling for the member state to be held accountable for their actions, as you would any other member state. We also have recommendations for the Palestinian Authority to fulfill their obligations to the Palestinian people. In this particular case, the children that have been essentially that are suffering because of the demolitions. So they also have accountabilities. Similarly, with any of the statements that we make, any of the reports that we do that are Gaza-based, we also have recommendations for Hamas as the de facto authorities. So Save the Children, we are not political in the sense that we don't take a political side, because we're a global organization that is rooted in child's rights, as I said, which are indivisible and universal. And we will call out to duty bearers where they do not meet those rights or do not meet those obligations. So again, I welcome you and your listeners to look at any of the statements we've released, particularly during the escalations in Gaza. We call on all sides to respect their obligations under international law. All of the reports that we write, we call for duty bearers. I think, what you might be looking at is because there might be a disproportionate call, because in this particular case, for example, the demolitions case, Israel there isn't the same power dynamic, because as an occupying power, they do occupy the West Bank, they do occupy Gaza, and with those come obligations in terms of maintaining that the people under the occupation, such as children, have their rights protected and respected. And that's all we're doing. We're asking for Israeli, the government, to meet those obligations as they have to. Similarly, for the Palestinian Authority that has obligations in the West Bank, we actually call for them to meet those obligations as well and ensure that they provide services for the children that have been affected. So again, I can stress, if there is a side that we take the side of children. And that's essentially all we do at Save the Children. In every context that I've worked on, we take the side of children, and we do make calls for accountabilities that I understand might be uncomfortable for certain member states, but we make them nonetheless for all duty bearers to account for those rights of children.
Thank you for that. During what you're saying, I did flash up briefly. You might have seen the report that you were talking about, Hope Under the Rubble.
Yep.
I think you can all see that now. And I want to talk about that in some detail. I know you just said something about Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law. A good part of that international humanitarian law is encapsulated within the Rome Statute, which Israel is not a signatory to, along with a number of other countries, including Canada, the United States, etc. So international humanitarian law is not universally embraced by all countries. So some aspects of it can be questioned.
Yeah, and again, under international, so the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is essentially what is the document that underpins a lot of the obligations of member states, including Israel, Australia, etc. Those, again, and the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, those are universal and indivisible. As I said, I don't think member states, any member state, Australia included, can pick out sections that they would like to adhere to and sections that they don't. As I said, the rights that all of us enjoy and every child should enjoy are universal. So it really doesn't matter where you are. And they're not indivisible. So you can't say, well, respect some of these rights, but not some of these other rights, because our domestic law is contradictory to those. And they're not in, and again, they apply all the time. It's not some of the time. So I think, all we're asking for, and this is the mantra for Save the Children, we uphold the rights of children, no matter where they are. And this is why, I'm so thankful of the work that Doron is doing as well, because it is critical. A child's life, irrespective of where they are, is a child's life. And what Save the Children does, in fact, many of the NGOs do, and many human rights organizations, is we simply call out when there are violations of those rights. Now, member states may not like this because it's again, no one likes to be called out for doing something that they shouldn't be. It's like when you're at school and the teacher's calling out for bad behavior, and you've done wrong, you've broken the rules. No one likes it, but we do it for everywhere. I mean, I've worked in many different contexts, and we call out from member states all the time. In fact, I've also worked in situations where you have de facto authorities, and they don't like it. We call them out because, again, we take the side of children. And children's rights are something that all of us should uphold, because if your listeners, like me, believe that we live in a world where every single child should be equal, not just equal, but every single child should have a hope that they can live out their dreams and their futures, I think it's our responsibility to support organizations like Save the Children, support organizations like Save the Children's Heart that Doron is doing, because we are the band-aids that are providing much needed support and services to children that don't get them otherwise.
Essentially, I've come here because of an article that you wrote, Jason, and a report that your organisation has produced. So I think you stand by that report. I would say, and if you say things in that report, I think that they're open for discussion. I think rather than
absolutely
laying things out in a report and then sort of leaving it there uncontested. That's why I think there are some things about the report that I do want to get to. Once again, if I can put up the report, show the report here for all of us. Here we are. So the report can here be seen, a 20-page report produced by your organisation, and we get to a foreword here by Michael Link. I mean, I need to point out for some of our listeners that Michael Link has actually been called out for being anti-Semitic for remarks he made at the UN Human Rights Council quite recently. He's not really considered to be very much a friend of Israel in many respects. Now, I think.
Can I ask a question, David? What do you consider a friend of Israel? Again, or a friend of Australia for that matter? My understanding is that a friend is someone who's there to support when you're doing the right thing, but will tell you when you're doing the wrong thing. I mean, this is a good friendship. And I think Michael Link is the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territory. And I think his role is to actually call out, in this particular case, the state of Israel, because he's the special rapporteur for Palestine, on some of the things that that I guess the duty bearers are not holding to account regarding, again, international law. So I understand he may not be popular, he may not because of the things he's saying, but again, what he's saying is rooted in law and fact. He's not creating anything, or he's not creating situations or reporting on things that are not happening. And as I said, as Save the Children, we are a rights-based organization. So all of our reports, all of our recommendations are rooted in law and in international law. And as I said, the many reports that we write globally, people don't like them, particularly member states when we call them out. So, for example, I came from the postings in Yemen. We wrote a lot of reports, and authorities didn't like them. Understandable, just like Australia would not like them. Save the Children Australia write a lot of reports on the practices of our government, particularly surrounding treatment of children for asylum seekers. Now, these are certainly illegal, and they're not popular. The Australian government may not like it, but I don't think you would say that we are not a friend of Australian government. It's just that we take the side of children, and everything that we say, the reports that we write, the statements that we make, the programs that we deliver are based on rights. And again, it doesn't really matter where you are in the world as a child, those rights are the equal, and every child has a right to a full expression of those rights and to have a future.
Okay. Once again, as I say, let's go back to looking at the report that was produced by you guys. This is the context of the report here, which is really the demolitions that are taking place in the West Bank. Much of the construction that is taking place in the West Bank is actually taking place in Area C, which is under full Israeli control according to the Oslo Accords, until a peace settlement is reached between Israel and the Palestinians. What's happening in the Area C in particular is Palestinians, with the help of the European Union, is trying to establish facts on the ground, preempting the establishment of a Palestinian state before acceptances. Now, do you think it's appropriate then for organisations like yourself to be encouraging the construction of buildings which they know from the very outset are illegal and likely to be demolished? These are homes that are being built theoretically for Palestinians, but if they're being built illegally, how is that proper practice?
Again, this is where I said there has to be equal application of the law. So whilst the Palestinians in the West Bank do fall under the Israeli military law, again, those Area C is meant to be handed over to the Palestinian Authority. It should be interesting to note that the Palestinians can only build in less than 1% of Area C. And that only 1% of the permits, to give you some data, up till 2020, 96% of the applications for Palestinians made for building in Area C were rejected. Now, there's an interesting report by an Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, that actually reported that there are over 100 Israeli outposts in the West Bank, which are illegal as well, because those outposts have not received the Israeli building permits and nor have been allocated for construction. So under Israeli law, those buildings are illegal. However, in contrast to the Palestinian communities, the Israeli outposts receive essential services such as access to electricity, water, infrastructure such as roads. And again, so I think, it's about looking at the equal application of the law. And that's all we're calling for, that any member state equally applies the law to give equal rights to all children that fall under its jurisdiction. I think, what you mentioned is the politicization again, where we're talking about why is there a different application of law, different treatment of different children? They shouldn't be. All children are equal, and this is all we're calling for. As Save the Children always said, for us, every child is equal. And so the practices that you apply to one child should be exactly the same to another child and their communities. In fact, there shouldn't be any difference. And this is what we're calling for. So all of, again, the reports, the recommendations, the asks that we have are rooted in international law. And again, all we're looking for is the accountability of member states to uphold those laws, as you would expect for any member state, Australia included.
Okay, thanks for those remarks. I just want to go a little bit further into this issue of the demolitions that are occurring, which are highlighted in your report. We have, of course, a section here for relevant international laws, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, you've got in your report findings and experience from people that you've spoken to in the Palestinian territories, but for some reason you can't ever give their real names. Now, in the report here outlines this methodology that you've followed, and this is what I'm looking at right now. In Area C, if we look at Area C is home to an estimated, I understand, about 180,000 to 300,000 Palestinians. Actually, in the whole of the West Bank overall, the population of the West Bank is about 2.7, 2.8 million. So Area C constitutes barely 10% of the West Bank Palestinian population. So the effect of these demolitions is only in affecting potentially 10% of the Palestinian population, because it doesn't affect Palestinians who live in areas A and B. So, and in your report's methodology, it stated that only 9% of those consulted for their experience and impact lived in areas A and B. So only 9% of your people that you spoke to were in areas A or B, and you've concentrated on areas C, which is only a fraction of the Palestinian population. So it's apparent, therefore, that your report has considered what could be taken as a very biased small sample from the overall Palestinian population in the West Bank. There are just two comments that can be attributed to Palestinians living in Area B, none from Area A, with this one not necessarily to do in any case with demolitions, the comment that's made. So the comment that I'm referring to was, I feel incapable of protecting myself. The soldiers and settlers can do anything they want anytime, so why bother? This is by Russia, who's a 16-year-old. So this is just a general comment which is not necessarily applicable to the matter of demolitions. So what do you say about the methodology you followed? Haven't you really cherry-picked here and not made a report which is really giving a picture of what's happening overall?
So again, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think it's a false equivalency. It's like saying, okay, we're going to do a study in Australia, but because majority of the population in Australia lives on the coast, what happens in the centre doesn't really matter. And again, when we look at, yes, majority of population of Palestinians live in area A and B, but Area C accounts for 70% of the land that is supposedly under the Palestinian territory as per the Oslo Accords. So the vast majority of the land is Area C. The populations are smaller because they're normally Bedouin herders. So again, when you have your large cities equivalent to Sydney and Melbourne, you have more people living there. But it doesn't mean that the rest of the country is not important. So one would argue that anything that happens within rural Australia, within any of the communities here in New South Wales, Victoria, is still linked to the broader issue of what happens in Australia. And that children that have issues in rural Australia still matter, because they're still children within Australia. The same thing with children in Area C. Just because they're a minority of the population, because they're Bedouin herders, so they don't live in large urban settings, doesn't mean that what happens to them is unimportant. So again, I think, just to draw to that false equivalency that you're mentioning. So it's important to realize that this thing is still happening to children. They're still experiencing the demolitions. Vast majority of them, unfortunately, have been forcibly evicted from their homes. I mean, to give you an example, just this week, the Bedouin community of Hamsa in the Jordan Valley, this is a community that unfortunately has, on the 7th of July or 7th of this month, been evicted. So these were 6 families, 24 children that were made homeless. And I know that there were lots of efforts from the international community, because this is a community that has been there. International community has provided homes, they provided shelter, food for these families, and of course they were all confiscated. So all we're asking for, again, is that there is equal application of the law. I'm not suggesting that one child is more important than another, that all children are equal. So the rights of children to have their rights fulfilled is critical. whether or not they live in a rural area, or they live in a capital city, or they live in an urban center, all children have the right to access healthcare. And thanks to Duran and his organization for providing that much needed healthcare for children who may not get access to that. They have a right to go to school, which means that they have to be kept protected. The schools have to be there. They have a right to live there, which means that their homes should be left there. They shouldn't be demolished. So I think this is why, again, it's important that every child that lives within the region, be they in Israel or Palestine, have the same rights and the same rule of law applied to them. And this is all that we're asking. Now, I don't understand the argument of saying, well, just because there's 10% of the population living in 70% of the land, it really doesn't matter. I think that's, again, a false equivalency. Even if one child lives there, it should not be happening to this one child. Just the way I see it in Australia, what happens in Orange, in regional Australia, is equally as important as what's happening in Sydney or Melbourne.
With the remarks you've been making, and we've been discussing some of what are I believe, are the tendentious points of the report. I haven't been speaking with Doron. I don't know whether, Doron, you're in a position to make any comments on the current thread of the conversation. I don't want to compromise you in terms of the role that you have in your organisation, but I also don't want to just leave you sitting there in the background without having anything to say. If you have anything that you would like to say at this point, feel free.
Yeah, no, I certainly wouldn't want to delve into the conversations you're having. As much as I'm enjoying listening to them, it's not my area of expertise, and certainly not my charter or my mandate. And I think probably I'm happy for you guys to continue, but I guess where I would either want to leave off or conclude is to say that, as Jason and I both referred to, what we do each and every day is to protect and look after children who otherwise wouldn't have access to the critical care that they need. That remains our mandate. But what I can say, as I guess a slight lean into the question here and the questions that have been asked, is I am absolutely proud that as an Israeli organization, that we are a shining example, strengthening the very fabric of Israel, strengthening Israel for that matter, a proud example that each and every day, how we sanctify the life of a child above all else. And I think the only other remark I'd like to make is we're not isolated. I've had worked in a number of organizations, communal organizations that are Israel-based, and we are not alone. There is a huge amount, many organizations across Israel and many other places, but disproportionately in Israel, that look to broaden their impact and their reach beyond the borders. This concept of tikkun olam, as we call it, which is helping and healing the world. We are not an isolated example. There are many others whose mandate is very much that. I'm proud of that fact, and there are many who look outwardly to demonize Israel across the board, often, as I think, without basis or much basis. I'm not saying there are not examples where everyone has an obligation, but certainly many act to the contrary, including ourselves. And as I said, if we can continue to provide deed over rhetoric, as I said at the beginning, to continue to create these positive interactions between all facets of Israel and our neighbors, and that bodes well for all parties and certainly for the children. So, I think that's probably all I can lean into this side of the discussion.
Thanks, Laura. I just want to add to that as well. I really am thankful for the work that you do, because we partner with many organizations who are Israeli-based organizations as well. Yeah. As I said, we are civil society. We're a rights-based organization. So we don't take a political side, because that's not our role. That's not our mandate. It's not our interest as well. As I said before, we take the side of a child, and irrespective of where that child is the most critical factor for us, and that's central to our being, and that's central to how we operate and the work that we do. As I said, what guides the principles of how we work is the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. So all of those rights are things that guide how we work, how we operate, the programming that we do, our advocacy. All of it is linked to rights. And I said, those rights are universal, so it really applies to all children. And again, I think, as I said, we work with many organizations. We have a broad-based organization. The needs of children are great. And this is what we aim to do, to actually serve those needs.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for that contribution. With the report, once again, you're backing your report up with its adherence to international law. The trouble is, a lot of international law is highly contestable. And one of the premises that you hook your report onto in terms of international law is Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from deporting or transferring parts of its own population into the territory it occupies. And the claim is made that the Israeli settlement enterprise in the West Bank is in violation of Article 49, Section 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, and also entails expropriation of Palestinian land in violation of Israel's duty to administer Palestinian public property for the benefit of the Palestinian people pursuant to Article 55 of the Hague Regulations of 1907, and to respect private Palestinian property pursuant to Article 46 thereto. Now, the trouble is that you hook your case onto Article 49.6, and I should point out at this particular point in time that this particular Article 49 of Article 6 of the Geneva Convention is very questionable, because the interpretation of this is not agreed on by a number of highly reputed international lawyers, one being Professor Eugene Kontorovich, who has written a very detailed report, and I'll just try and bring that up now, share that for you to see. And I commend that you have a look at this particular report, because it goes into a lot of important detail, which I think you perhaps may not be aware of.
I think maybe the best way forward, and now I really urge your listeners to read our report, as it is publicly available. It's called Hope Under the Rubble. And I think it's a read that shows, again, this is the lived experience of what children are experiencing. So now, I'm not an international humanitarian law expert, although I wish I would. It would make my job some easier in some respects, because, I do think it's important that these international frameworks that globally we've agreed upon, this is how the world functions in terms of rule of law. Now, I would urge your readers to look again at the determination of themselves. They can go through the report, see what they find. Again, for me, what is heartbreaking is the actual experience of children, which we can't deny. Now, I think that any child going through any of those, having a home demolished and suffering, I would hope that everyone can agree to that, at least, that is something that we should avoid at all costs. Now, in terms of international law, as I said, I'm not an international humanitarian law expert. However, many experts that have been contributed, in fact, many of the UN resolutions that are currently regarding the status quo have been passed by the UN, and I'm sure that a lot of them are expert in international law. In fact, many of them are part of the founding bodies that have enshrined them, and I would urge your listeners again to go study those for themselves. But what I would like to say is that, irrespective, again, I just don't. I feel like we're getting sidetracked. What we were supposed to be talking about was about how do we help children, has come into a very, very semantic and unnecessary argument about, again, what I feel is detracting us from the main mission, is that should children, any child, go through what is happening now in the occupied territory, I think everyone would argue no, irrespective of whether they're Palestinian, whether they're British, whether they're Israeli. No child in the region should ever be going through what is happening now. And collectively,
I think that
it is important for us, including Australia as a member state, to look at how do we address this. And part of that is to ensure that all parties abide by what they're supposed to do, their obligations under international law. But I understand that you have some concerns regarding specific articles. Now, I am not a lawyer, so I can't argue those points, but my understanding, at least the legal opinion of the UN, of many other member states is that the Fourth Geneva Convention and the laws within are universal. Now,
can I just point? I mean, I think I want to make it clear that it's important that I mean, I know what you're saying is very much tearing at the heartstrings of a lot of people, because we all agree without any question that the welfare of children is a very great importance. But if a case is made which is got holes in it from a point of view of international law, and as you freely admit, you have not the expertise, but you still take for granted the aspects of international law, because it is, as I say, I commend anybody who's listening to this to go and read this report. And one particular thing I want to highlight about this report is that if we look at states that are involved in occupations and population transfers, there is a great list of them. We can look at Tibet, we can look at Crimea, Ukraine and Georgia, which has been occupied by Russia. We can look at Cambodia, Lebanon, where Syria has been very prominent, Nagorno-Karabakh, Cyprus, with the involvement of Greece and Turkey. There are many countries, and do we hear about concerns in these particular countries as we hear about what's happening in Israel? It's a completely disproportionate representation. And what I'm concerned about is that Save the Children is hooking itself onto this anti-Israel bandwagon. I mean, you mentioned the United Nations in particular as well. I mean, the United Nations amongst people in the Jewish world is considered to be very biased against Israel. If one looks at the resolutions that have been passed by the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly, there's the weight of resolutions that are against Israel, demonizing Israel, is just absolutely extraordinary. So what I'm trying to get across to you is that do the work you're doing, Jason, as we commend, but don't necessarily hook your bandwagon onto a lot of this what we would call anti-Israel rhetoric that is not necessarily based on correct interpretations.
Can I interrupt you there for a second? So I may not be an international humanitarian lawyer, but many of the teams, particularly within Save the Children, are. And again, many of the international organizations like the UN have the expertise. So I personally do not, but the organization does, and many organizations do. And again, I would just like to point out, we are looking at a rights-based approach. There are many violations of rights for children that happen globally. And wherever Save the Children work in those countries, we call them out. So there is no difference between our operations and what we do in the occupied territory versus what we do in, for example, Myanmar, what we do in Yemen, what we do in Australia. It is universal. We call out when those rights or those breaches of those rights occur, and it is not linked to any one group of people or another. It just happens on the duty bearers. So in this particular case, the violations of the rights that occur for children living in the occupied Palestinian territory, we call the State of Israel because they are the occupying power. Similarly, as we would in any other country where there is an occupying power or a government, we will call out on that government to actually respect the rights of children. So I think your aspersion that somehow Save the Children is anti-Semitic is a false one, because we call out member states of all nationalities, of all ethnicities, whenever they actually don't respect the rights of children or don't uphold the obligations and the international laws. Now, I do urge your readers to look at the report. In fact, look at any of the reports that we have, everything that we publish, we stand by. I do think, it's obviously a very emotive topic, and I understand that for some reason there is a very, very strong correlation between calling out a member state, as you would any other member state. For example, if any member state does violate the rights of children, we will call them out. It doesn't mean that we are anti that particular government or that people. is that we are protecting the rights of children and asking for the rights of children to be upheld. And I think that's the take-home message that I would like your listeners to look at, to hear today. Read our report. Definitely read many of the reports. We've got many reports that we have submitted regarding what is the plight of children, what is the underlying causes for why they're vulnerable. Again, children are more vulnerable because of reasons and the underlying root causes. And unless we actually address those root causes, these vulnerabilities will not disappear. Again, the work that Doron and my organization are doing, we are just band-aids. We are trying to provide services. We're trying to make sure that children's lives are made better. But these we're not the solution. The solution has to be one that addresses the underlying vulnerabilities of children. And in this particular case, as in many other cases in parts of the world, what makes children more vulnerable or groups of children more vulnerable than others is because there's unequal application of the law. There isn't equal rights for children. And this is the case in the occupied Palestinian territory, where you do have unequal rights of children. And all we're asking for is a situation where equal rule of law applies, that you have children that are able to express themselves, their freedoms, and the rights that they deserve. And I think that's the most important thing for all parties, and that's, I stress, all parties, to meet their obligations. And in the case of the occupied Palestinian territory, this is the State of Israel, member State of Israel. This is the Palestinian Authority for the West Bank. And these are for de facto authorities, i.e. Hamas in Gaza. And also the international community, because the international community, we do have obligations under international law to ensure that all member states uphold the obligation to children. So I know that we're running really, really late now, and I think we've gone far beyond time, but this is the take-home message that I would like your listeners to look at. Please, I welcome you to look at our reports. There's many reports that we've written, particularly surrounding some of the issues surrounding children and the vulnerabilities in the West Bank, that I urge your readers to look at, so that you can orient yourself and understand what is it that drives the vulnerabilities for children, and how collectively, as an international community, we take those steps so that we actually protect all children in the world.
Well, as you say so appropriately, we are running out of time. I could also mention that your call to accountability of the Palestinian Authority has been never seen by me. I think a lot of people are aware of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, and the work it does in educating children in the Palestinian territories, and the problems that are seen in the education of these children by the school books that they read that perpetuate the conflict. And I don't know whether you've ever taken any interest or concern in the fact that these children whose minds are seriously affected by what they learn at school to continue their antipathy towards Israel and the Jewish people is really much a serious concern. And I would hope that you might turn your attention at some time to these aspects of the situation, and start to perhaps criticize or express concerns about what's happening on the Palestinian side. But I think you might be in certain difficulties because of the way that Palestinian society operates. I don't know whether you've spent any time in Gaza in your stint in the Palestinian territories, but I think that if you were to speak out openly and express anything that is a concern about what's happening on the Palestinian side, you might find yourself in trouble very quickly.
And again, I urge your listeners to go and look at the statements that we've made. And again, when Save the Children, we actually have called out on Palestinian authorities, both within Gaza and the West Bank, to uphold their obligations. As I said, Save the Children, we are a rights-based organization. So those rights of children, we call out whoever the duty bearers are. And again, I have been to Gaza, I have been to the West Bank, and authorities may not like what we say. Definitely authorities, again, we've spoken out on all duty bearers. So I do urge your listeners to look at some of our previous reports, look at some of the statements that we've made. We have been very clear that the rights of children is what guides the work that we do, the statements that we make, and the reports that we publish. But thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today, and also for you, Doron. It's nice to meet you.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you for the work that you're doing as well, particularly surrounding getting access to a lot of children in Gaza for medical care, because, you know, as I said, I've been to Gaza, and like you alluded to, the services there and the availability of health facilities is so far inferior to what is available, that a lot of the complications that children have, particularly surrounding congenital heart diseases, or indeed any medical condition, be there an acute emergency or a congenital or disease, they just don't have the resources or the infrastructure or the expertise available to treat children. So I think it's a wonderful thing that your organization is doing to meet that need, because again, children in Gaza just do not have the same level of healthcare. So thank you for doing that.
My pleasure. Great. Thanks for having me as well. It's been most enjoyable.
Yeah. Thank you, both of you, very much for your contribution to this discussion, which certainly highlights some very important issues and complex issues. And I think we've aired stuff for a lot of people to be seriously considering. Thank you very much, both of you.
Right. Thanks. Take care.
Take care. Stay safe.